Jackson Whitaker threw the money at the old man's feet without blinking. "Take it. Take every dollar, and be gone before I ride back through." Walter Brooks stared at the coins scattered in the dirt. His hands trembled, but he did not reach for them. "Mr. Whitaker," the old man said quietly, "there are people inside that cabin who cannot walk, cannot leave, cannot survive another winter without help." Jackson tightened his jaw. "That ain't my problem." He turned his horse and rode away. He believed that was the end. He was wrong. If this story already moved something in you, stay with me, because what Jackson finds when he rides back to that cabin will change everything you thought you knew about wealth, loneliness, and the kind of love that builds itself out of nothing. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, because part 1 is just getting started. The morning Jackson Whitaker rode out to survey his newest acquisition. The sky over Montana was the color of old iron, flat and cold and indifferent to everything beneath it. He liked mornings like that. They matched the way he thought. Clean, uncomplicated, free of sentiment. He had purchased the northeastern parcel 3 weeks earlier through his land agent in Helena. 460 acres of frontier range, a creek that ran strong through April, and timber enough to build 3 more bunkhouses if he needed them. The price had been reasonable. The seller had been desperate. Jackson had not asked why. He never asked why. At 45 years old. Jackson Whitaker had learned that asking too many questions about other people's circumstances had a way of slowing a man down. He rode alone the way he preferred. His horse, a gray quarter horse named Flint, moved with steady confidence across the frozen grass. Jackson sat straight in the saddle hat, pulled low coat, buttoned to the collar against the October wind that swept down from the mountains like it had a personal grievance. He had not expected anyone to be on the land. The smoke stopped him first, a thin column rising from behind a stand of pine trees pale against the iron sky. Jackson pulled Flint to a halt and studied it. Not a wildfire. Too contained. Too deliberate. Somebody was burning wood in a stove or a fire pit, and they were doing it on his property. He nudged Flint forward. The cabin materialized through the trees like something the land had forgotten it owned. Small, low-roofed, built from rough-cut logs that had gone gray with age and weather. One of the front shutters hung at an angle, half its hinge rusted through. The porch boards were warped and split. Whoever had built this place had built it a long time ago, and nobody had maintained it since. But there was smoke coming from the chimney, and there was an old man in the side yard splitting firewood. Jackson rode to within 20 feet and stopped. The old man looked up. He did not startle. He did not run. He simply set down his axe and looked at Jackson the way a man looks when he has already accepted whatever is coming. He was somewhere north of 70, thin-shouldered, white-haired. His coat was too light for the weather, the elbows worn through, and his boots had been resoled so many times the leather no longer matched itself. But his eyes were steady and calm, and he held himself with a quiet dignity that Jackson had not been expecting. An old woman appeared in the cabin doorway. She was carrying a clay bowl, and she moved slowly the way people move when their joints have stopped cooperating with their intentions. She saw Jackson and stopped. Neither of them looked afraid. That bothered Jackson more than fear would have. "You're on private land," Jackson said. His voice was even. He had delivered this line before in different forms to different people. It was not a threat. It was simply a fact. "This parcel transferred to me on the 15th of October. You need to tell me who you are and what you're doing here." The old man straightened slightly. "My name is Walter Brooks. This is my wife Eleanor. We've been on this land for 11 years. The man who sold it to you, he didn't tell you we were here. He did not." Walter nodded slowly, as if this answered a question he had been asking himself for weeks. "No, I don't reckon he would have." "You have a legal arrangement?" Jackson asked. "A lease, a deed, anything in writing?" "We had an understanding," Walter said. His word, nothing on paper. Jackson looked at the cabin, then at the old woman in the doorway, then back at Walter. "A man's word don't hold up against a deed of title," he said. "You know that." "Yes, sir, I do." "Then you know you've got to go." Walter was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere inside the cabin, something shifted, a footstep maybe, or the settling of old wood. Mr. Walter began. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, I understand your position, and I'm not here to argue with the law. But Eleanor and we need a little time before we can leave. She's been under the weather, and there are things inside that need tending before we can go anywhere. Jackson studied him. How much time? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Jackson almost said no. The word was already forming in his chest, rising out of habit, out of the reflex that had served him well for 20 years of business. You didn't give people time. You gave people terms. Time led to complications. But something stopped him. He looked at Eleanor, still standing in the doorway with that bowl in her hands, watching him with eyes that were measuring something about him that he couldn't quite name. And he looked at Walter, who was not begging, not bargaining, just standing there in that too-thin coat with his axe on the ground beside him, waiting for a verdict. I'll make you an arrangement, Jackson said. You stay for 3 weeks. In exchange, you work the property, clear the deadfall along the north fence, mend what you can on that porch, clean out the creek drainage before it freezes solid. I'll pay you a fair daily wage. When the 3 weeks are up, you take the money and you go. That's the deal. Walter looked at his wife. Eleanor gave a small nod. That's fair, Walter said. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Jackson touched the brim of his hat, turned flint, and rode back through the trees. He told himself he had done it for practical reasons. The deadfall needed clearing. The creek drainage was a legitimate concern. He would have had to pay someone to do the work anyway. This was simply efficient. He was good at telling himself things like that. He came back 4 days later to check on the progress. Walter was working alone in the yard, stacking split logs against the side of the cabin. He was moving slower than before, carefully, like a man managing pain he had decided not to mention. Jackson dismounted and walked the fence line, checking the work. It was good work. Methodical. Thorough. The kind of work done by someone who took pride in the task, regardless of whether anyone was watching. But as he came back around the front of the cabin, he noticed something. Eleanor was not there. He had not thought about it on the ride in, but now he realized he had not seen her at all since he arrived. Not in the yard, not on the porch, not in the doorway with a bowl in her hands. And Walter, he noticed, kept glancing toward the cabin door. Not casually, with worry. The particular worry of a man trying not to let it show. Where's your wife? Jackson asked. Walter set down the log he was holding. She's inside. She's not feeling well. Same sickness as before. It's gotten a bit worse. Walter paused. She's been running herself hard, more than she should. Jackson frowned. Running herself hard, doing what the two of you are the only ones here. Walter was quiet. He looked at the cabin door. Then he looked back at Jackson with those steady, measuring eyes. Mr. Whitaker, he said carefully. There's something I should have told you when you first rode out here. I didn't, because I was afraid of what you'd decide. But I think you ought to see what's inside that cabin before you make any more decisions about this land. Jackson felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite alarm. More like the feeling a man gets right before a card gets turned over that changes everything on the table. Open the door, he said. Walter walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. And Jackson Whitaker, who had walked into 100 difficult situations without flinching, stopped dead in the threshold and could not move. The cabin was small. 1 room, maybe 2 if you counted a curtained area in the back corner. The ceiling was low, the rafters dark with age and smoke. There was a single wood stove in the center burning steadily, and the warmth inside was thick with the smell of pine smoke and medicine and something else. The particular smell of old age and endurance of bodies that had weathered more than most people ever would. And the room was full of people. Not 2, not 3, 7, 8. If you counted Eleanor, who was lying on a low cot near the far wall, her face pale against a folded blanket that someone had tucked carefully around her shoulders. 7 elderly men and women sitting or resting or moving slowly around that single room, their faces turning toward the open door with expressions that ranged from wariness to resignation to something that looked very much like the particular calm of people who had stopped being surprised by disappointment. An old man with one arm sat in a chair by the stove, his empty sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder. A woman with white hair braided down her back was carefully folding linens at a small table. Two elderly men sat on the floor near the window, one resting with his eyes closed, the other watching Jackson with the steady, unreadable gaze of someone who had seen men like him before and had learned what to expect. Jackson stood in the doorway and did not speak. I was not a man who lost his words easily. He had faced confrontations, courtrooms, property disputes, business negotiations that turned hostile before they concluded. Words had always been available to him, an orderly row of tools he could reach for when he needed them. But standing in that doorway, looking at those 8 people living inside 4 crumbling walls, with their dignity arranged around them like they owned a palace, he had nothing. Then he became aware of the 9th person in the room. She had come through the curtained doorway at the back, and she was moving toward Eleanor's cot with a small cup in her hands, and she had not yet looked up because she was watching where she stepped, careful not to spill whatever was in the cup. She was not elderly. She was young, or at least younger than everyone else in the room by 30 or 40 years. She was a full-figured woman, broad-shouldered and soft-faced, with dark hair pinned up and several strands loose around her face from a long day of work. Her dress was simple and worn at the hem. Her sleeves were pushed up to her elbows. Her hands were capable and gentle, the hands of someone who used them constantly and without complaint. She reached Eleanor's cot. She crouched down. She said something quietly that Jackson couldn't hear and helped Eleanor sit up enough to drink from the cup. Then she looked up. Her eyes met Jackson's across the room. Brown eyes. Steady and warm, and in this moment very tired. Not afraid. Not apologetic. There was something in her expression that he recognized, though he could not immediately name it. A kind of settled certainty, the look of a person who has decided what they believe and is prepared to defend it regardless of what it costs them. "Mr. Whitaker," Walter said from behind him. "This is Clara Bennett." Clara held Jackson's gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way you nod at a man who holds your fate in his hands, but whom you have decided not to beg. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Jackson stepped inside. The one-armed man by the stove shifted in his chair and watched him. The woman folding linens kept folding, but her movements slowed. The man near the window with the steady gaze did not look away. "How long?" Jackson asked. It was the only question he could find. Clara set the cup carefully on the edge of Eleanor's cot and stood up. 3 years for some of them. 8 months for others. Harriet. She nodded toward the woman folding linens. "Came to me last winter. Her family moved to Oregon and told her there wasn't room for her in the wagon." Jackson looked at the old woman folding linens. She was moving the same piece of cloth over and over now, smoothing it with practiced hands, pretending not to hear her own story being told in front of a stranger. "And you've been keeping them here," Jackson said. "All of them, feeding them, tending them." "Yes, sir." "On what?" "On whatever I could earn in town, taking in mending and washing, selling eggs when the hens are laying. Walter and Eleanor were here when I arrived. They let me use the cabin because they couldn't tend it themselves anymore. We've been helping each other along." Jackson looked at the roof. There was a dark stain spreading across 2 of the rafters, the kind of stain that meant the boards above them were soaked through. "The roof's going," he said. "Yes, sir." "Those corner walls are bowing. The whole structure's going to start settling before spring." "Yes, sir, I know." He looked at her again. "And you stayed anyway." Clara met his eyes without flinching. They didn't have anywhere else to go. Something moved in Jackson's chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Not pity. Pity was simple and self-satisfied, and he had no use for it. This was something older and more complicated. The particular ache of a man who recognizes something true when he sees it and cannot argue his way out of the recognition. He looked around the room again, at the man with the pinned sleeve, at Eleanor lying on her cot, at the man near the window who still had not looked away from him. "What's your name?" Jackson asked him. The old man blinked. "Thomas Reeves," he said. His voice was low and slightly rough, like a door that needed its hinges oiled. How old are you, Thomas? 71. Where'd you come from? Colorado originally. Came up to Montana with a cattle outfit in '69. Stayed on after the outfit folded. Worked a small claim near Billings for a while. A pause. My son was going to come for me last spring. Said he'd have a place for me by June. Thomas looked at the window. June came and went. Jackson said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel hollow. He turned back to Clara. She was watching him with that same settled expression, not pressing him, not appealing to him, just watching. The deal I made with Walter was for 2 people, Jackson said. I know. Not 9. I know that too. You could have told me. You could have had us all arrested, she said evenly. Trespassing. Illegal settlement on private land. The law would have backed you up completely, and every one of these people would have been put out in the October cold, with nowhere to go. I didn't know you yet, Mr. Whitaker. I didn't know what kind of man you were. She tilted her head slightly. I'm still figuring that out. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Eleanor shifted on her cot and made a small sound, and Clara glanced at her automatically, the reflex of someone who spent most of her waking hours tracking other people's needs. What do you need right now? Jackson asked. Today, this week. What's most urgent? Clara looked at him steadily, as if testing the sincerity of the question. Then she exhaled. The roof over the back corner needs patching before the next rain, or it'll come through completely. Eleanor needs the medicine the doctor in town sells. I haven't had the money. Robert. She nodded toward the one-armed man. His wound from the war never healed properly. It flares up in the cold. He needs a proper poultice, not what I've been making do with. What else? Blankets, food. We're not wanting right now, but winter's coming fast. What else? She paused. That's enough for now, Mr. Whitaker. I'm not greedy. Jackson put on his hat and turned toward the door. I'll be back in 2 days, he said. He walked out into the cold air and stood beside Flint for a moment, looking at the sky. The iron color had shifted while he was inside. There were clouds building to the northwest, heavy and dark, the kind that carried real weather. I thought about what he had just seen. He thought about Thomas Reeves waiting for a son who never came. He thought about a woman folding the same piece of cloth over and over in a cabin. She had no legal right to taking care of people nobody had come back for. And he thought against his will about a 12-year-old boy standing at the edge of a newly dug grave, understanding for the first time that there was nobody left who was going to come for him either. He mounted Flint and rode toward Helena. He was back in 36 hours. He brought lumber and tar paper for the roof. He brought 2 bottles of the medicine the doctor had recommended for Eleanor's chest. He brought the ingredients for a proper poultice and a list of instructions from the pharmacist in town. He brought 4 wool blankets, a 50-pound sack of flour-dried beans, salt pork, and 2 dozen eggs. He did not announce any of it. He simply arrived, unloaded everything from the pack horse, stacked it on the porch, and went around the side of the cabin to look at the roof. Clara appeared beside him while he was still calculating the angle. You came back, she said. I said I would. People say a lot of things. She paused. The lumber's good quality. Better than we'd have gotten. I don't buy inferior materials. No, I don't reckon you do. She looked up at the damaged section of roof. I can help with that. I'm not helpless. Never thought you were. They worked side by side for most of the day. Jackson on the ladder with the hammer and Clara below handing up materials, holding boards in place, directing him to spots she had already identified as weak. She knew the cabin's failing better than he did every draft, every soft patch of floor, every place where the structure was beginning to surrender to time. She worked without complaint and without performance. She did not try to impress him or convince him of anything. She simply worked. By mid-afternoon, the back corner was patched. Not beautiful, but solid. Weather tight enough for the winter. Jackson came down from the ladder. Clara was already gathering the extra lumber, stacking it neatly against the cabin wall. Why'd you start this? He asked her. She kept stacking. Start what? Taking in people nobody wanted. She was quiet for a moment. Because I know what it feels like, she said finally. To be in a room full of people and feel like you're invisible. To have folks look right through you because you don't fit what they think a person ought to look like. She set down the last board. I know what that feels like. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the ability to make sure somebody else didn't feel that way, I was going to do it. Jackson looked at her. How old are you? He asked. 35. You've been doing this since when? Since I was 28, 7 years. She looked at the cabin. It started with one person, old man named Clarence, who used to sit outside the general store in town every day, because his daughter had told him he couldn't come inside her house anymore. He was outside in the rain one November. I brought him in. She paused. He brought a friend. The friend brought another. It just grew. Nobody helped you. Her expression shifted very slightly. Most folks in town think I'm peculiar. A single woman my size choosing to spend her life caring for old people nobody wants. A brief pause. I've heard what they say. I don't let it slow me down. Jackson thought about the way the people in town must have looked at her. The way he had seen people looked at before, the sideways glances, the lowered voices, the particular cruelty of a small community deciding someone didn't fit. He had seen that brand of dismissal applied to many people over the years. He had sometimes, to his own shame, simply walked past it. They're wrong about you, he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her work apron from the porch rail and went back inside. He stayed for supper that evening. He had not planned to. It happened the way things happen when you don't pay attention to where your feet are taking you. One moment, he was loading the empty pack horse, and the next, he was sitting at the small table inside the cabin with 7 elderly people, Clara and Walter, passing a pot of beans and salt pork between them. Thomas Reeves sat across from him. The old man had thawed slightly enough to talk about the cattle outfit he had ridden with in his younger years. The rivers they crossed, the storms. They endured the foremen he'd admired and the ones he hadn't. The woman who had been folding linens, Harriet Jackson recalled, turned out to have a sharp and completely unexpected sense of humor that surfaced twice during supper and made everyone at the table laugh. The one-armed man. Robert said almost nothing. But at the end of the meal, he looked at Jackson and said simply, "Thank you for the poultice. My arm feels better already." Jackson said, "Good." It was the smallest exchange. It meant more than most conversations he'd had in years. After supper, Clara walked him out to where Flint was tied. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "And I need you to answer me straight." "Go ahead." "Are you going to let us stay?" Jackson looked at the cabin. Through the small window, he could see the glow of the lamp and the shapes of people moving in the warmth. "I'm going to come back," he said. "And I'm going to keep fixing what's broken. And we'll work out the rest as we go." Clara studied him. "That's not a straight answer." "No," he admitted. "It ain't." She tilted her head. "Are you a man who does what he says he'll do?" Jackson thought about that. About the times he had kept his word and the times he hadn't. About the kind of man he had become in the years since grief had taught him to keep everything at arm's length. "I'm trying to be," he said. Clara nodded slowly. "Then I'll take that for now," she said. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker." "Good night, Miss Bennet." He rode back toward Helena with the cold wind in his face and the image of that lamp-lit window sitting in his chest like an ember that hadn't been there in a very long time. He told himself it was only logistics. He had property to manage, a roof that needed ongoing attention, residents who needed to be formally accounted for if he was going to avoid legal complications down the road. It was simply practical to continue engaging with the situation. Howe was very good at telling himself those things. He came back 3 days later. He brought more lumber because the east wall needed bracing before the freeze deepened. He found Clara in the yard splitting wood, and she moved over without comment to let him help, and they worked together through most of the morning in a companionable silence that neither of them acknowledged. Inside, Eleanor was sitting up and looking better, the medicine doing its work. She smiled at Jack when he came in to check the east wall. A warm, uncomplicated smile that went straight past his defenses because it didn't want anything from him. "You have kind eyes," Eleanor told him. "You work very hard to hide them. but they're there. Jackson had no answer for that. He found himself staying longer each time he came. Not because the work required it, because something about being inside that cramped, leaking, imperfectly patched cabin, surrounded by people who had been cast off by the world and had decided to build something anyway, made the hollow rooms of his Helena mansion feel like something he had been mistaken about for a very long time. He did not tell Clara any of this, but he noticed she had stopped looking at him with that careful, measuring wariness. She still watched him. She was a woman who paid close attention to everything, but the quality of her attention had changed. It was less like the assessment of a threat, and more like something she couldn't quite name, but was choosing not to examine too closely. He understood. He was doing the same thing. The 3 weeks of their original arrangement had long since expired. Neither of them mentioned it. One evening as October moved into November, and the first real cold closed down over Montana like a hand pressing flat. Jackson arrived to find Clara sitting on the porch step in the near dark, her head bowed, her hands still in her lap. She looked up when she heard his boots on the frozen ground. Her eyes were red. He did not ask. He sat down on the step beside her, not too close, and waited. After a long time, she said, "Edmund died this afternoon. He was one of mine since the beginning. He came to me when his wife passed, and his sons divided up the furniture and forgot to figure out what to do with him." She paused. "He was 74. He used to tell jokes that weren't funny at all, and we all laughed anyway." Another pause. "He passed quiet. He wasn't alone." Jackson said nothing. He was not good at comfort. He had never learned the right words for it, and he did not trust himself enough to try the wrong ones. But he stayed. He sat on that cold porch step beside Clara Bennett until the stars were fully out above Montana and the cold had gone deep into the ground, and he did not leave until he was sure she was ready to go back inside. It was the most useful thing he had done in years, and somewhere inside the armor of distance and practicality and carefully managed solitude that he had built around himself across 20 years of living alone, something that had been very still for a very long time began quietly to move. The morning after Edmund's funeral, Jackson Whitaker arrived at the cabin before dawn. He did not knock. He had stopped knocking 2 weeks ago, not because anyone had told him not to, but because the cabin had quietly stopped feeling like someone else's space and started feeling like a place he had a right to enter. I was not sure when that had happened. He was not sure he was comfortable with the fact that it had. Clara was already up. She was always already up. He had begun to suspect she did not sleep so much as pause between tasks, resting just enough to keep herself functional, and then returning to the work that never finished. She was at the stove stirring something in the large pot, and she turned when she heard the door. She looked better than the night before. Not rested, he doubted she had slept much, but recomposed. The red around her eyes was gone. What remained was the particular settled expression she wore when she had processed a grief and filed it somewhere deep and was choosing to move forward. He respected that about her. He recognized it. He had spent 20 years doing the same thing. "You're early," she said. "I brought supplies." He set the crate down on the table. "More medicine for Eleanor. Liniment for Robert's arm. And there's a proper doctor coming out from Helena on Thursday. I've arranged it." Clara stopped stirring. She turned fully and looked at him. "You arranged a doctor to come out here?" "The man on the porch, James, his breathing's been wrong for 2 weeks. And Eleanor needs to be properly examined, not just managed with what I can bring from town." "Jackson." She stopped. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it at the same time. She straightened slightly. "Mr. Whitaker, that costs money." "I'm aware of how money works, Miss Bennett. I'm not a charity case." "None of you are," he said. "But a doctor is coming Thursday, and he's going to examine everyone in this cabin, and you're going to let him, and that's the end of it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through the equation, the pride she had maintained through 7 years of doing this, largely alone, measured against the reality of 7 people in her care who needed more than she could currently provide. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "I've been told." She turned back to the stove. "Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. You might as well sit down." He sat down. Thomas Reeves appeared from behind the curtain in the back, moving slowly in the morning cold, but moving with purpose. The man had decided somewhere in the past 2 weeks to start making himself useful during the mornings, and he had taken on the task of carrying wood from the porch to the stove with a seriousness of purpose that suggested it mattered to him to have a task that mattered. "Morning," Thomas said to Jackson as he passed. "Morning." "Cold one." "It is." Thomas set the wood down beside the stove, straightened with a small grunt, and lowered himself into his chair. "My son wrote," he said without preamble or particular inflection. Jackson looked at him. "What did he say?" "Said that he's been busy." Thomas stared at the stove. "Said he'd try to get up this way in the spring." A pause. "He said that last spring, too." The room was quiet except for the sound of Clara stirring and the wood settling in the stove. "I'm sorry," Jackson said. Thomas glanced at him. You didn't do anything?" "No, I know. I'm sorry anyway." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the strange thing is? I don't even want to see him that much anymore. I think I just wanted to know he was still thinking about me." He looked at his hands folded on his knees. Turns out that's the harder thing to ask for. Harriet came in from the back room, already dressed, and began setting the table with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had kept a household for 50 years and was not about to stop just because circumstances had changed. She noticed Jackson in his chair and said without breaking her stride, "You're here early. Are you staying for breakfast or do you just hover?" "Staying," Jackson said. "Good. You look like you need feeding." She set a bowl in front of him with decisive authority. "You've been looking drawn lately. A man your size shouldn't look drawn." Clara turned from the stove with the pot, and Jackson caught the edge of a smile she was not quite quick enough to hide. He filed it away. That smile. The way it arrived without announcement and disappeared before she decided it was safe. How was filing away more things about Clara Bennett than he had realized until this moment. The doctor came on Thursday. His name was Aldous Pryor, and he was a compact, serious-faced man in his 50s who had spent 30 years treating homesteaders and miners across the territory and was not easily unsettled by difficult circumstances. He spent 4 hours in that cabin, moving from person to person, with the brisk competence of someone who worked efficiently because time was always short, and at the end of it, he came out to the porch where Jackson was waiting. "The woman Eleanor, her chest needs continued treatment. She's stable but fragile." Pryor pulled out a notepad. "The man with the arm. Robert, there's an infection that's been running low grade for years. It needs proper attention, not just management. I'll send out a proper prescription from Helena." He looked at his notes. "James has a constriction in his lungs. Not fatal immediately, but it'll compromise him significantly in hard winters. He needs warmer sleeping conditions than what's in that back room." He paused. "The others are in surprisingly good condition for their circumstances. Someone has been doing very attentive ongoing care." "Clara Bennett," Jackson said. Pryor nodded. "She has better instincts than most trained nurses I've worked with. She's been keeping Robert's infection from becoming catastrophic for years with improvised poultices. Whatever she's been using actually has some genuine medicinal value." He looked at Jackson steadily. "These people are alive largely because of her. And they won't keep being alive through the winter in a structure that's losing heat the way this one is." "I know, I'm working on it." "Work faster, Mr. Whitaker." Jackson worked faster. He hired 2 men from town, capable close-mouthed laborers, who did the work without asking unnecessary questions, and spent the better part of a week reinforcing the east wall, insulating the back room where James slept, and addressing the most critical structural issues in the cabin. He also built a small addition to the north side. Nothing elaborate, just enough to give Eleanor and Robert separate sleeping spaces where the temperature could be better managed. Clara watched all of this with the careful attention of someone tracking both the progress and the implications. She worked alongside the laborers where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, and she asked practical questions and accepted practical answers and never once made the mistake of being effusive about what was being done. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. What he did not appreciate was Richard Coleman riding out on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November. Richard Coleman was Jackson's business partner of 14 years, a lean, sharp-featured man from back east, who had come to Montana in 1874 with capital and ambition, and a head for profit that Jackson had found useful in the early years of building his land holdings. They had expanded together shrewdly and systematically, and their partnership had been productive in the way that partnerships between two men with complementary skills and similar priorities can be. The priorities had been similar then. Jackson heard the horse before he saw Richard, and he came around the side of the cabin to meet him, instinctively, positioning himself between Richard and the cabin door. He noticed himself doing it, and recognized what it meant. Richard pulled up and looked at the new wall construction and the addition framing with an expression of studied calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I heard you were spending time out here," Richard said. "I thought I should come see for myself." "You've seen it," Jackson said. "What exactly is this, Jackson?" "It's a property I own. I'm making improvements." "For whom?" "For the people living here." Richard looked at the cabin, then back at Jackson. "And who are the people living here?" "Elderly individuals who need housing." A pause. "Elderly individuals." Richard said it the way you repeat a phrase when you're determining whether the person who said it is serious. "Jackson, the Caldwell Company has made an offer on this parcel. I told you about it 3 weeks ago. It's a strong offer, more than you paid, and the timber rights alone." "I'm not selling the parcel." Richard blinked. "You're not, Jackson. This is a business decision. The numbers are straightforward. There's no rational reason to decline. The numbers don't account for everything. The numbers account for everything that matters in a land transaction." "That's where you and I are going to disagree," Jackson said. Richard looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his expression that Jackson recognized, the particular recalibration of a man who has realized the situation is different from what he assumed and is working out what that means for him. "Is it the woman?" Richard asked. Jackson kept his expression even. "Say that again." "There's a woman here. That's what I've been told. Some sort of caretaker person. Plus-sized woman, unmarried. People in town think it's peculiar that you keep coming out here." Richard's voice was not unkind exactly. It was merely the voice of a man who believed he was being practical. "Jackson, you're 45 years old. You're a wealthy man with a significant reputation in this territory. Whatever sentimental interest you've developed in this situation, enough." Jackson's voice was quiet. That particular quiet that people who knew him well had learned to respect. "You've made your observation. Now I'm going to make mine. This parcel is not for sale. The people living on it are going to remain here. What I spend my money doing on my own property is my business and not yours. And if you'd like our partnership to continue being productive, I'd suggest you ride back to Helena and leave this particular matter alone." Richard stared at him. "You're serious?" "I am always serious." A long pause. Then Richard pulled his horse's head around. "This is a mistake, Jackson. You're letting sentiment compromise your judgment. I've never seen you do that before." "Then it's overdue," Jackson said. Richard rode away. Jackson stood in the yard and watched him go, feeling the cold settle around him and something else settle inside him. A clarity that arrives when you have made a decision you cannot take back and discover with some surprise that you don't want to. Clara appeared in the cabin doorway. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying him. "He's right that it's a mistake, financially." "I know that. You don't strike me as a man who makes financial mistakes willingly." "I don't." He looked at her. "But I've been making a different kind of mistake for 20 years, and I think the accounting on that one is worse." Clara was quiet for the moment. Something moved across her face. Not the settled, managed expression he usually saw, but something more unguarded, quick and warm, and then tucked away before it could be examined. "Come inside," she said. "Harriet's made coffee. It's better than it has any right to be." He went inside. The week that followed was the first week Jackson stayed on the property overnight. It happened practically. James had a difficult night, his lungs seizing in the deep cold, and Clara was up through most of it managing him. And by the time the crisis had passed, it was 4 in the morning, and the ride back to Helena made no sense. Jackson slept in the chair by the stove, and when morning came, Clara handed him coffee and said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, and that was that. He stayed the next night too, and the night after. He told himself it was because James needed monitoring. He told himself it was because the structural work required early starts. He told himself many things in those November days, with varying degrees of conviction. What was actually true was simpler and more frightening. He did not want to leave. The cabin had a quality that his Helena mansion, with all its size and expense and emptiness, had never managed to achieve. It was alive in the way that only places full of living people can be, not comfortably alive, not easily alive, but genuinely and stubbornly alive. The way things are when survival has been worked for rather than purchased. Thomas told stories in the evenings. Not always good stories. Sometimes they were simply accounts of things that had happened. Cattle drives or harsh winters or ordinary days that had stuck for no obvious reason. But he told them with the steady voice of a man who had been keeping them for years against the possibility that someone might eventually sit still long enough to listen. Harriet argued with everyone and loved everyone with complete and unsentimental dedication, and she had decided somewhere around the end of the second week that Jackson needed mothering, and she pursued this project with considerable determination. "You hold your shoulders like you're waiting for someone to hit you," she told him one evening. "My first husband held himself like that. It took me 4 years and a lot of patience to get it out of him. I'm not your husband, Mrs. Harriet. Obviously, my husbands were much less stubborn." She pointed at the bowl in front of him. "Eat the beans." He ate the beans. Robert, the one-armed man, had a skill Jackson discovered by accident. The man had spent 30 years as a cartographer before the war, and he had a remarkable capacity for spatial memory and measurement. When Jackson mentioned a drainage problem on the north edge of the property, Robert spent 2 hours questioning him about the terrain in careful detail, and then produced from memory and a stub of pencil a sketch of the drainage pattern that was more accurate than the survey maps Jackson had paid for. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jackson asked. "Same place everyone learns anything," Robert said. "By paying close attention for a very long time." Clara watched Jackson discover each of these people the way she watched everything with quiet, careful attention that held both warmth and a measured reserve. She did not push him toward them. She did not comment on what she saw happening. She simply went about the work of keeping the household alive and let the relationships form themselves. But she was aware of them forming. He could tell by the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, with an expression that mixed something like relief with something considerably more complicated. One afternoon, while they were reinforcing the new north wall, Clara passed him a board and said without looking up, "I heard what you said to your partner, about the 20 years. Jackson positioned the board. "You weren't meant to hear that. I know, but I did." She handed him a nail. "What did you mean by it?" He drove the nail in, then another. He was quiet long enough that she might have thought he wasn't going to answer. "I was 12 when my parents died," he said finally. "Fever took them inside of a week. I had an uncle who took me in because there was no one else, and he was not a bad man, but he had 4 children of his own and not a lot left over. So I learned not to need much." He drove another nail. "I learned that needing things from people was unreliable, that they'd disappoint you not out of cruelty just because they had too many other things to need. So I stopped needing." He looked at the wall. "Built an entire life around not needing anything I couldn't acquire with money or effort. It's a very efficient system." Clara was quiet. "It's also," he said, "extremely lonely." He hadn't meant to say that last part. It arrived without his permission, and once it was in the air, he could not retrieve it. He kept his eyes on the wall. "Yes," Clara said simply. "I know." He looked at her then. She was looking back at him with those steady brown eyes, and there was no pity in them, which was the thing he had always dreaded most. The thing that had kept him from telling anyone anything true about himself for longer than he could count. There was only recognition. The look of someone who had lived inside the same kind of fortress and understood both why it had been built and what it cost. "You lost people too," he said. "My mother when I was 16. My father 2 years later." She paused. "I had a husband briefly. He left after the first year, said I was too much." She said it plainly without bitterness, The way you state a fact that stopped having power over you after you decided to stop giving it any. I was too much in every direction that apparently mattered to him. Too large, too determined, too certain about the things I cared about. He was a fool, Jackson said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she handed him another nail and looked back at the wall. He wasn't entirely wrong, she said. I am determined, and I'm very certain about the things I care about. A pause. I'm just not convinced those are the problems he thought they were. Jackson held the nail in his hand and did not drive it for a moment. They're not, he said. Clara didn't respond, but the line of her shoulders shifted very slightly, and he filed that away too. The next morning, the trouble arrived on horseback. 2 men from the county land office rode out with a leather folder of papers and the expressions of men who had been told this would be a routine matter. They were not unfriendly. They were also not flexible. The older of the two, a man named Garrett, with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had delivered bad news before and had made a kind of peace with it, explained the situation without preamble. Mr. Whitaker, we've received a formal complaint regarding the occupancy of this structure. The concern being that the current residents, 9 individuals, are occupying a private property without documented legal status. He opened the folder. County code requires that any communal occupancy of private land be registered as a designated dwelling with appropriate capacity assessments. The structure here has not been registered. The occupants have no formal housing documentation. That puts everyone in a difficult position. Whose complaint? Jackson asked. Garrett paused. We're not at liberty to. Whose complaint? Another pause. A business representative. I'm not at liberty to say more. Jackson looked at the folder. He did not need to think very hard about who had decided to introduce the county land office into this situation. What's the process for getting this registered? He asked. Garrett blinked, apparently having expected more resistance. You'd need to file a formal dwelling designation with the county. Have the structure assessed for capacity and safety. Document the occupancy arrangement. It can take 6 to 8 weeks in normal circumstances. What happens to the residents in the meantime? In the meantime, technically, Garrett glanced at his colleague. Technically, they'd need to vacate the premises while the registration is processed. These people are elderly, Jackson said. It's November. Where exactly do you suggest they go? Garrett had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mr. Whitaker, I understand the situation is. Where do you suggest they go? Jackson said again, not loudly, just with that particular quiet that went through people like cold water. Garrett was silent. I'm going to need those forms, Jackson said. All of them. Today. I can send them from. You have them in that folder. I can see them. I want them now. Garrett looked at him for a moment, then at the cabin, then back at Jackson. He reached into the folder and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. He held them out. Jackson took them. The structure assessment also needs to be completed, Garrett said, by a certified assessor. When's the next one available? I'd have to check the. Check. Jackson pulled out his wallet. And tell him I'll pay triple his normal rate if he comes out before Friday. Garrett stared at the money. Then he put it in his pocket. I'll see what I can do. Thank you, Garrett. Jackson nodded at him. Tell whoever filed the complaint that they're welcome to try again. I'll be here. The 2 men rode away. Jackson stood in the yard with the folder of forms and felt the particular cold fury of a man who has been targeted, not for anything he's done wrong, but simply because he's become inconvenient. Clara appeared behind him. Richard Coleman, she said. Most likely. Can you fight it? I can. He looked at the papers. It'll take time. And money, and they'll make it as difficult as they can if they want to. Will you? He turned and looked at her. She was standing straight, chin level, and there was no fear in her face. Whatever the answer was, she had already decided she would face it. That was simply who Clara Bennett was. Yes, he said. I will. Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. Not relief. She was not the kind of woman who needed rescuing and responded to it with uncomplicated gratitude. It was more complex than that. It was the look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just discovered with some surprise that there might be someone next to them willing to share the weight. "Then we'd better start on those forms tonight," she said. I can write. I've been dealing with county paperwork since the first time a town official tried to have Clarence moved along from outside the general store." She held out her hand for the folder. "Give it here. I know what these things are asking for better than you do." He looked at her outstretched hand. Then he gave her the folder. And standing in the cold November yard, with the registration forms, and the weight of what was coming, and the cabin behind them full of people who were depending on both of them to hold the line, Jackson Whittaker understood something that no business deal or land acquisition had ever taught him. He was no longer doing this alone. He did not know when that had happened. He knew it terrified him. He also knew that terror in this particular case felt remarkably like the first moment of something true. That night, while the rest of the cabin slept, he and Clara sat at the small table by the lamp and worked through the forms together. Her handwriting neat and deliberate. His voice steady as he recalled the dates and measurements and legal descriptions she needed. They worked in the particular silence of two people who have run out of the effort it takes to maintain distance and have simply quietly stopped trying. It was almost midnight when Clara set down her pen and pressed her fingers to her eyes. "We'll get it done," she said. Not to him specifically, more to the room or to herself or to all the sleeping people behind the curtain. "Yes," Jackson said. "We will." She looked at him. In the lamplight, with her hair loose around her face and her expression unguarded in a way it almost never was, she looked like something he did not have a word for. Not beautiful the way people use that word carelessly, something more specific, more substantial. The kind of face that becomes more itself the longer you look at it, that has the quality of something real in a world where real things are rarer than most people admit. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. She gathered the forms and set them carefully to one side and went behind the curtain. Jackson put out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the frozen ground, and the cabin creaked around him with the small sounds of a structure learning to hold. He did not think about Richard Coleman. He did not think about the county forms, or the legal complications, or the business implications of what he was doing. He thought about Thomas Reeves, who had stopped watching the road for his son. He thought about Harriet, who argued with everyone and loved everyone without apology. He thought about Robert, who saw the world with the precision of a man who had always paid close attention. And he thought about Clara, asleep behind a thin curtain in a cabin she had built into a home through sheer, stubborn, unglamorous love. And he thought, this is what I was missing. All those years. All that land. All that money carefully accumulated and carefully protected. This is what I was missing. He slept in the chair by the stove, and when morning came, he was already thinking about what needed to be done next. The county forms were filed on a Monday. By Thursday, Richard Coleman had filed a counter-complaint. Jackson found out from Garrett, who rode out with the uncomfortable expression of a man delivering news he had not asked to be the carrier of. The counter-complaint alleged that the dwelling registration Jackson had submitted contained irregularities, specifically that the structure did not meet minimum safety standards for communal occupancy, and that the land use designation Jackson had applied for conflicted with an existing commercial development application filed by a company called Caldwell Western Properties. Jackson read the document twice, standing in the cold yard, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "When was the Caldwell application filed?" he asked Garrett. Garrett looked at his boots. 4 days ago. After I told Coleman I wasn't selling. Mr. Whittaker, You're just delivering papers, I know." Jackson looked up. "What does the commercial development application claim?" "It designates the parcel as intended for a cattle transit operation. Holding pens, feed stations, commercial infrastructure." Garrett paused. "If the application is approved, the existing residential use designation would be subordinate to the commercial claim. Meaning the residents would have to go. Meaning the county would have significant pressure to require the structure be vacated, yes." Jackson said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Garrett. I'll be in contact with my attorney." Garrett nodded with the visible relief of a man who has completed an unpleasant errand and is now free to leave, and he rode away. Jackson went inside. Clara took one look at his face. What happened? Coleman moved faster than I expected. He put the folded document on the table. He's filed a commercial development application on the parcel through Caldwell Western. It's a blocking maneuver. If it goes through, the county has grounds to supersede our residential designation. Clara picked up the document. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, without rushing, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the details were where the real damage was hidden. When she finished, she set it down. He's trying to bury us in paperwork, she said. Yes. Can he do it? Not if I move faster than he does. Jackson sat down. But it's going to require money. Legal fees, county filings, possibly a hearing before the land board. It won't be simple, and it won't be cheap. Clara looked at the document on their table. Then she looked at Jackson. How much? More than you have, he said, not unkindly. How much of what you have? He met her eyes. Enough that it'll matter. She was quiet. He could see her working through the same equation she always worked through: the pride, the practicality, the reality of 8 people depending on her, measured against the cost of accepting help she had not asked for and could not repay. This started because of me, she said. It started because Coleman is greedy, and I own something he wants. You're not the cause, Clara. She looked at the document again. Those people in the back room, she started. I know. Robert can't go anywhere in the deep winter. Eleanor isn't strong enough. James. I know, he said more firmly. Which is why I'm going to Helena this afternoon to see my attorney, and you're going to stay here and not let anyone from the county set foot on this property without coming to get me first. Understood? Clara stared at him. You don't give orders to me, Mr. Whitaker. No, I'm asking you, firmly. A beat. Then, with a reluctance that had traces of something warmer underneath it, she said, Fine. He was in Helena by nightfall. His attorney was a measured, methodical man named William Holt, who had handled Jackson's property interests for 11 years and had never once seen his client make a decision that wasn't grounded in hard numbers. He listened to the full situation without interrupting his pen, still his expression carefully neutral. And when Jackson finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands on the desk. Let me make sure I understand, Holt said. You want to challenge Coleman's commercial application, pursue the residential designation, establish permanent legal housing protection for 9 elderly individuals on private land, and you want to do this against a man who has more capital than goodwill and has already demonstrated he's willing to be aggressive. That's correct. Jackson. Holt's voice was careful. The legal costs alone will be significant. And if Coleman escalates, which he will, because that's who he is, you could be looking at months of proceedings. The county land board is not predictable. The commercial application has real weight. What do we need to beat it? Holt considered. Evidence that the commercial application is a pretext, that it was filed in bad faith specifically to circumvent the residential use claim. That's a high bar. We'd need documentation, witnesses, a clear timeline showing Coleman's application came as a direct response to your refusal to sell. He looked at his hands. We'd also need the structure to pass a safety assessment before the county moves against it. Do you have that? I'm having the work done. It needs to be complete and certified before any formal hearing. How long do we have? Holt looked at the documents Jackson had brought. If Coleman pushes hard, the land board could convene in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Jackson sat back. He thought about the east wall and the new north addition and the list of remaining structural issues he had been working through. He thought about the assessment certification and the registration forms and everything that still needed to happen before the cabin could clear county review. He thought about Clara at that small table in the lamplight, her handwriting neat and deliberate, doing the work. Start the challenge, he said. File everything we have, and find me a certified assessor who can be on that property by Monday. Holt looked at him for a long moment. This is personal for you. It's the right thing to do. Those aren't the same statement. No, Jackson said. They're not. File the papers, William. Holt filed the papers. Jackson rode back to the cabin the next morning to find Thomas Reeves and Robert sitting at the table, and between them, spread across the full width of the surface, was a hand-drawn map. Robert had produced it overnight, a detailed rendering of the property, the cabin placement, the new addition, the drainage patterns, the fence lines, all laid out with the precise spatial memory of a man who had spent 30 years making maps. "What's this?" Jackson asked. "This," Robert said, "is your argument." He pointed with his good arm to the northern section of the property. If Coleman's claiming commercial development, he needs vehicle access. A cattle transit operation of the scale his application describes would require a road here and a water source here. None of those exist on this parcel. The terrain doesn't support it. He looked up at Jackson. His application is false on its face. You just need someone to say so in front of the board. Jackson looked at this map, then at Robert. "Would you be willing to testify?" he asked. Robert set down his pencil. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm 73 years old, and I have one arm, and I haven't been inside a formal proceeding in 20 years. He paused. "Yes. If it keeps these people in their home, yes." Thomas leaned forward. "I'll go too. I'm not much for legal arguments, but I can sit in a room and make people look at me, and sometimes that matters." Jackson looked at the two old men across the table from him. He did not have words for what moved through him in that moment. The particular weight of being stood beside by people who owed him nothing and were choosing to stand there anyway. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough, but it was what he had. Clara had been in the back room and came through the curtain as Thomas and Robert began rolling up the map. She read Jackson's face the way she always did, quickly and accurately. "Good news?" she asked. "Progress." He looked at her. "Robert's map might be what breaks Coleman's application." Clara looked at Robert. Something warm moved through her expression, not surprise because she had always seen what Robert was capable of, but satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone whose faith in a person has been publicly confirmed. "Of course it does," she said simply. "He's been the sharpest person in this room since the day he arrived. It just took the right question to prove it." Robert made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Don't go inflating my reputation, Clara. I'll have to live up to it." "You already do," she said. Then she turned to Jackson. "What do you need from me?" "The assessor is coming Monday. I need you to walk him through everything. What's been done, what's been improved, what you've maintained over the years. You know this structure better than anyone." "All right. And Clara." He paused. "The residents need to know what's happening. All of it. Not a softened version. They deserve to know what they're facing." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "I know. I'll tell them tonight." He nodded. He started toward the door, then stopped. "Are you afraid?" he asked. He was not entirely sure why he asked it. The question surfaced without plan, the way honest questions sometimes do. Clara considered. "I've been afraid since the day I started this. Every winter afraid we wouldn't have enough. Every time someone new got sick afraid I wouldn't know how to help them. Every time I looked at this roof afraid it would give out before I could do anything about it." She paused. "Being afraid and moving anyway is the only way I know how to do anything." Jackson looked at her. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say." Clara shook her head. "It's just honest." She turned back toward the curtain. "Monday, I'll be ready." He left and rode through the cold, thinking about honesty and bravery, and the way some people made them look like the same thing. The assessor arrived Monday, as promised, a stocky man named Briggs, who carried a leather instrument case and moved through structures with the focused thoroughness of someone who did this work because he believed in it, rather than because it was a transaction. Clara walked him through every room, every wall, every repaired joint and reinforced beam and patched section of roof, answering his questions precisely and without exaggeration in either direction. Jackson watched from the doorway of each room, tracking both the assessor's responses and Clara's. She was, he thought, extraordinary in this. Her knowledge of the structure was complete. Her ability to explain what had been done and why was clear and unhurried. And she answered the harder questions, the ones about what was still inadequate, with the same directness she brought to everything. Briggs finished his examination and stood in the main room with his clipboard writing his notes. "It's not up to code on 3 specifications," he said. "The ceiling height in the back addition, the window-to-floor ratio in the east room, and the chimney liner needs replacement." "How long to address those?" Jackson asked. Briggs looked at his notes. "The ceiling height is structural. You'd need to modify the addition framing. 3 days of work, maybe 4. The windows can be cut larger in a day. The chimney liner is the biggest job. That's a week minimum if you want it done properly." Jackson looked at the ceiling. 12 days of work roughly against a 6-week window. It was tight, but possible. "I need this certified before the land board convenes," he said. Briggs looked at him over his clipboard. "Mr. Whitaker, I certified what's in front of me. I can't certify what isn't done yet." "No, but you can come back once it is." "I can. Then I'll be in contact." Jackson extended his hand. "Thank you for your thoroughness." Briggs shook his hand, glanced once more around the room and left. Clara exhaled slowly. 12 days. Approximately. You have workers who can start tomorrow. I'll have them here before noon. She looked at the ceiling, calculating. The chimney liner is what worries me. That's the one I can't help with. I know a man in Billings. He specializes in it. I'll send a wire today. Clara turned and looked at him fully. You've already thought of all of this. I've been thinking about it since William told me about the hearing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Jackson, what does this cost you in total? All of it. He knew she was asking not just about money. She was asking about everything: the partnership with Coleman, the business implications, the reputation considerations, the 100 practical costs that a man in his position paid when he chose to spend his capital on something the world of commerce did not consider an investment. He told her the truth. More than most people would spend, less than it's worth. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Why? She asked quietly. And I want the real answer, not the practical one. The real answer. In the same place, he kept most honest things somewhere below the level at which language operated in the part of himself that had been very still and very quiet for a very long time, and had only recently begun to move again. Because I spent 20 years building things that didn't matter, he said. And I found something that does, and I'm not walking away from it. The silence between them had weight. Not uncomfortable weight, the weight of something true that has just been said and is still settling into the room. That's a good answer, Clara said finally. It's the only one I have. She nodded once and went back to work. The workers arrived the next morning, and the cabin became, for the better part of 2 weeks, a place of organized, productive noise hammering and sawing and the steady industry of men who had been given clear work and fair pay. The residents adapted without complaint. Harriet informed the lead carpenter that the east wall needed to go up straight this time because she was tired of looking at a wall that leaned like a man who'd had too much whiskey, and the carpenter, to his credit, took this completely seriously and made sure the wall went up straight. Thomas kept the workers company during their breaks, telling stories, asking questions about their families and their work with the genuine interest of a man who had always liked people and was grateful for new ones to talk to. Robert sat near the window with his map, refining it, adding notations, preparing for the land board hearing with the systematic focus of a man who had found his purpose for the season. Eleanor, for the first time in weeks, sat outside on the porch in the afternoon sun, thin sunlight, November sun, but real, wrapped in 2 blankets, watching the activity with an expression of quiet amazement. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, she told Clara one afternoon. You're not asleep, Eleanor. I know. But she looked at the workers at the new framing going up on the addition at Jackson, crossing the yard with a load of lumber. 11 years we were on this land, and nothing changed. And then this man came along and everything changed. She paused. Why? Clara followed Eleanor's gaze to where Jackson was working coat off, despite the cold sleeves rolled, moving with the economical efficiency of a man who had grown up doing physical labor before money made it optional. He had gone back to it without any visible self-consciousness, as though the work itself was what he'd always wanted an excuse to return to. I'm not entirely sure, Clara said honestly. I think he saw us. Really saw us. And I think that surprised him more than it surprised us. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And you? She asked. Does he see you? Clara kept looking at the yard. Eleanor, I'm old, not blind. He sees the situation, Clara said carefully. He sees what needs to be done. Clara Bennett, Eleanor said with the gentle implacability of a woman who had been watching human beings for 70 years. That man has been looking at you every time he thinks you're not watching since the second week he came here. Clara said nothing. And you, Eleanor continued, have been doing the exact same thing. The porch was quiet except for the sound of hammering from inside. It's complicated, Clara said finally. Of course it is. The real things always are. Eleanor pulled her blanket tighter. I'm just saying, don't let complicated become an excuse for nothing. Clara helped Eleanor back inside shortly after and did not think about the conversation for the rest of the day. She thought about it all night. The chimney man from Billings arrived on a Wednesday and finished on a Tuesday, and certified his work with a written statement that Holt added immediately to the legal file. Briggs came back on a Friday, moved through the improved structure with his clipboard, made notes for 40 minutes, and on the following Monday, delivered a provisional certification pending the land board's formal review. Holt presented it at the county office on a Tuesday morning. Coleman's attorney challenged it by Thursday. The challenge alleged that the certification had been rushed, that the assessor had potential conflicts of interest, a claim with no apparent basis that was designed primarily to create delay, and that the commercial development application should be given precedent. Jackson heard about the challenge via telegram while he was at the cabin and stood in the yard with the paper in his hand. For a moment, feeling the particular cold anger of a man who has done everything right and is watching the game being rigged anyway. He went inside. He sat at the table. He looked at the telegram. Clara sat down across from him without being asked. What is it? He handed her the telegram. She read it. Her expression did not change, but he saw her jaw tighten very slightly. The tell he had learned that meant she was more upset than she intended to show. He challenged Briggs, she said. Yes. On what grounds? Invented ones. It doesn't matter. It's a delay tactic. He wants to push the certification into disputed territory so the land board has grounds to table the residential designation. Can he succeed? Jackson thought about William Holt, who was methodical and thorough and had now developed what appeared to be a personal investment in winning this particular fight. He thought about Robert's map waiting in its careful roll in the corner of the cabin. He thought about Thomas, who had said he would sit in that room and let people look at him, because sometimes that was enough. He might win some time, Jackson said. He won't win the hearing. Clara set down the telegram. She looked at him with an expression that was very direct and very clear, the expression she wore when she had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. What do you need from me at the hearing? You'd have to speak. Tell the board the history when you arrived, what you built here, how long the residents have been on the property, what the practical reality is. He paused. They're going to ask difficult questions about your legal status before I arrived, about the arrangement with Walter and Eleanor, about the money and where it came from. I'll answer every question honestly. Some of the honest answers aren't comfortable. Most honest answers aren't. She folded her hands on the table. Jackson, I've been doing this work for 7 years without any legal protection and very little practical support. Walking into a county hearing and telling the truth is not the hardest thing I've done this year. He looked at her hands. Strong, capable, slightly roughened from years of work that required them. The hands of someone who built things that mattered with the materials available. No, he said. I don't imagine it is. 3 days before the land board hearing, the second twist arrived. It came not from Coleman or the county or the courts, but from a direction Jackson had not been watching because it came from inside the cabin. Eleanor collapsed. Not dramatically. She simply sat down in the middle of the afternoon and could not get up, and when Clara reached her, she found her cold and pale and barely responsive. And the panic that moved through the cabin in the next 30 seconds was the particular panic of people who have already lost too much and cannot afford to lose anything else. Jackson was in the yard when Harriet appeared in the doorway and said his name once sharply, and the way she said it told him everything before she said another word. He was inside in 10 seconds. He saw Clara crouched beside Eleanor with her fingers on Eleanor's wrist, her face set with the specific controlled focus she used when she needed to be competent faster than she felt. "Get Dr. Pryor," Clara said. "Now." "I'll ride. Send one of the workers. You stay." She looked up at him. "I need you here." He sent a worker at a full gallop to Helena. He stayed. He stayed beside Clara while she kept Eleanor warm and monitored and as stable as everything she knew how to do could make her. He stayed while the other residents moved around them. Thomas hovering near the doorway, Robert sitting in his chair with his hands folded and his face still with the particular stillness of a man who is praying without quite admitting that's what he's doing. Harriet making tea with swift mechanical purpose, because Harriet always responded to crisis by finding something useful to do with her hands. Walter sat on the floor beside Eleanor's cot and held her hand and said nothing. He had said almost nothing since she had first gotten sick. There was a kind of love in his silence that Jackson felt like something physical. "She's not going to die," Clara said quietly to Jackson, not to the room. She was not asking. She was stating it the way she stated everything she had decided was true, with the flat conviction of someone who had chosen not to entertain the alternative. "How do you know?" Jackson asked. "Because I'm not going to let her." She looked at him. Her eyes were steady. "Hand me that blanket." He handed it to her. Dr. Pryor arrived 3 hours later. He examined Eleanor for 20 minutes and came out and told them it was her heart. Not a crisis, not a catastrophic event, but a warning. Her heart was working too hard. She needed complete rest. She needed warmth. She needed, he said, not to be moved anywhere in the winter cold under any circumstances. Walter looked at Jackson when Pryor said that last part. Jackson held Walter's gaze. "She's not going anywhere," he said. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. He did not apologize for it. He simply nodded once and turned back to Eleanor. That night after Pryor had gone, and the cabin had settled into its nighttime rhythms, and Eleanor's breathing had steadied into something approaching normal, Jackson found himself standing outside in the dark for a long time, looking up at a sky so thick with stars, it seemed to have no empty spaces left in it. He thought about the hearing in 3 days. He thought about Coleman, who had filed another motion that afternoon through his attorney, a request for an emergency injunction that would freeze all property modifications pending the board's decision, which if granted would undercut the structural certification. He thought about Eleanor, whose heart was warning her that time was not as infinite as the people who loved her needed it to be. And he thought suddenly, and with great clarity, about a different way to approach what was coming. I went back inside and found Clara sitting at the small table in the dark, not sleeping, not working, just sitting. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "I can tell you have an idea." He sat. "I'm going to make an offer at the hearing." She waited. "Not to Coleman, not about the land." He leaned forward. "I'm going to propose to the land board that this property be formally designated as a charitable dwelling, a permanent residential community for elderly individuals without family or housing support. Not just registered, legally designated. That designation would make it functionally untouchable by commercial development claims." Clara stared at him. That exists. My attorney found it in the territorial code this afternoon. It's rarely used, but it exists, and it's exactly what this is." He looked at her. "It would mean I give up the commercial value of the land permanently. I can never sell it for development. It becomes in legal terms a charitable property in perpetuity. And Coleman's application would be incompatible with a charitable designation. The board would have to choose between the two. And in a public hearing with Robert's testimony, and your testimony, and the people in that room visible and present, I believe they'll choose correctly." Clara was quiet for a long time. "You'd give up the development value permanently," she said. "Yes. That's not a small thing." "No." "And you're certain?" Jackson thought about Eleanor's breathing, about Walter on the floor holding her hand, about Thomas and Robert and Harriet and James, and all the people behind the curtain who had built a life in this place because Clara had refused to give up on them. Clara. He looked at her directly. I've been certain about this since the first morning I rode back to that cabin with lumber and medicine instead of eviction papers. I just hadn't found the right legal framework for it yet. Clara looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. In the dim lamplight, in the small hours of the night, in the cabin that was still settling into the new shape, it was becoming something shifted in Clara Bennett's face that had nothing to do with legal strategy or structural assessments or county filings. Something quiet and deep and entirely honest, the expression of a woman who has guarded herself for a very long time and has just found with some wonder that the guard is no longer as necessary as it used to be. Jackson, she said, yes. This has to work. It's going to work. She held his eyes for a moment that stretched longer than strategy required. Then she straightened in her chair and set her hands flat on the table. Then let's go over everything William needs to know before Thursday. They worked until 3 in the morning. And when Thursday came, Jackson Whitaker walked into the county land board hearing with his attorney on one side, a rolled map under his arm. 2 old men who had decided to stand for something, and the absolute iron certainty of a man who had finally, after 20 years, found the right thing to spend his life on. The board called them to order, and in the back row, watching with steady brown eyes and her hands folded in her lap, Clara Bennett waited to tell the truth about the people nobody had come back for. The county land board met in a low-ceilinged room in the Helena courthouse that smelled of wood oil and old paper, and the particular mustiness of a space where important things had been decided by men who were not always certain they were making the right decision. There were 5 board members seated at the long table at the front. The chairman was a heavy-set man named Alderman Fitch, who had the look of someone who had sat in this room for many years and had developed through long exposure to human conflict over land and money. A certain weathered fairness that was neither warm nor cold, but simply accurate. Beside him sat 2 men Jackson recognized from previous county dealings. Cautious measured the kind of men who waited to see which direction the room was moving before they committed. And 2, he did not know, one of whom was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Ellison, who served as the board's legal recorder and occasionally voted, and who was watching the room with sharp, quiet eyes that missed nothing. Coleman was there with his attorney, a polished man from back east named Forsyth, who wore his suit like a credential and had the smooth assurance of someone who had won most of his hearings by making the other side feel outmatched before a word was spoken. Coleman himself sat slightly behind Forsyth, composed his expression, the deliberate neutrality of a man who is winning and knows it and is being careful not to show it. Jackson sat at the opposing table with Holt. Robert was to his left. Thomas was beside Robert. Both old men had dressed carefully for the occasion. Thomas in a clean shirt and a jacket Jackson had not seen before Robert, with his empty sleeve pinned neatly and his map rolled under his remaining arm. They sat straight. They looked at the board without flinching. Clara sat in the 3rd row of the gallery, with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her expression composed in the way it was always composed when she had made up her mind about something. Fitch called the hearing to order and read the dual claims into the record. Coleman's commercial development application and Jackson's residential charitable designation request, with the flat precision of a man narrating a document rather than a human conflict. Forsyth spoke first. His argument was polished and linear and entirely divorced from the human reality of what was being discussed. He presented the commercial application as a straightforward property development matter, the kind of thing the board handled routinely with economic projections and infrastructure proposals and language designed to make the cabin and its residents sound like an administrative irregularity rather than a home. Mr. Whitaker's residential claim, Forsyth said, while sympathetic in its intent, lacks the legal precedent and structural certification required for permanent designation. The provisional assessment. The certification is complete, Holt said without raising his voice. Forsyth paused. The certification was provisionally issued and is currently under formal challenge. The challenge was filed without evidentiary basis and was dismissed by the certification office on Monday, Holt said. He slid a document across to Fitch. Received yesterday. The certification is full and final." The room registered this. Forsyth's composure held but just barely. Coleman behind him shifted very slightly in his chair. Fitch examined the document. Then he looked at Forsyth. "Counsel, your challenge to the certification has been dismissed. That argument is no longer available to you. Please proceed on other grounds." Forsyth proceeded. He was good enough to pivot smoothly, shifting his argument to the commercial application's economic merit and the county's interest in development revenue. He spoke for 12 minutes. He was persuasive in the way that well-prepared arguments delivered by skilled speakers always are, and Jackson watched the two cautious board members and saw them tracking the logic with the particular attention of men who were not immune to it. Then Holt presented the charitable designation request. He was less polished than Forsyth and considerably more thorough. He walked the board through the territorial code provision, the legal history of charitable property designations, the structural certification, the medical documentation for the residents, the timeline of occupancy. He was precise and unhurried, and when he was done he said, "We have witnesses who can speak to the circumstances directly, with the board's permission." Fitch looked at the papers in front of him. "The board will hear testimony." Robert went first. He walked to the front of the room with the careful economy of a man managing a body that required more attention than it once had, and he unrolled his map on the table in front of the board and did not apologize for taking up space. He explained the terrain of the parcel in exact measured terms, the drainage patterns, the water access, the access road requirements for a cattle transit operation of the scale. Coleman's application described the mathematical impossibility of the infrastructure claims given the actual topography. He spoke for 11 minutes. He used no dramatic language. He made no emotional appeals. He simply stated what was true and demonstrated it with evidence he had constructed himself from memory and expertise, and 30 years of professional competence that had not diminished simply because the world had stopped asking for it. When he finished, Fitch leaned forward. "Mr. Reeves, is it?" "Yes, sir." "You compiled this assessment yourself?" "Yes, sir. I spent 30 years as a territorial cartographer. I know this kind of terrain. I know what it will and will not support." Robert met Fitch's eyes. "That application is not a development plan. It's a document designed to take a home away from people who have nowhere else to go. I wanted the board to understand the difference between the two." The room was very quiet. Margaret Ellison, the woman on the board, was looking at Robert with an expression that was not neutral. It was the expression of someone who has just recalibrated the weight of what they're holding. Thomas testified next. He did not bring documents or maps or data. He stood in front of the board and said in his steady, unhurried voice exactly what he had told Jackson that first week in the cabin. He talked about the cattle outfit and the claim near Billings and his son, who had said he'd come in June. He said it without asking for pity and without performing grief. He simply told the truth the way people do when they have nothing left to lose by it. "I am not a burden," Thomas said. "I am not a problem to be relocated. I am a man who spent 50 years of his life building things in this territory. And when I needed somewhere to be, Clara Bennett gave me a place to stand." He looked at this board. "The county has an opportunity right now. You can let a company take that place because it's profitable. Or you can decide that what Clara built is worth protecting." He paused. "I know which decision you'll be able to live with in 10 years. I think you probably do too." He walked back to his seat. Fitch was still for a moment. Then he said, "Is Miss Bennett present?" Clara stood from the third row. "Yes, sir." "Will you come forward?" She came forward. She stood in front of the board with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Fitch and then at each of the other board members in turn, the way she looked at everything directly, without apology for the space she occupied. "Miss Bennett," Fitch said, "tell the board in your own words how this situation came to be." Clara told them. She started at the beginning. Clarence outside the general store in the rain. The decision she'd made, the one person who became two, who became seven. She told them about the years of doing this on almost nothing. The winters that were close, the times she had not known how they would make it through, and they had made it through anyway. She told them about Walter and Eleanor, and the understanding they'd had with the previous landowner, and how that understanding had evaporated when the land changed hands. She told them about Jackson. She told them what he had done, not to praise him, not to use him as an argument, but because it was part of the truth, and she was committed to the full truth. She described what he had brought, and what he had built, and what he had chosen, and she said it in the plain, factual way she said everything, and somehow that plainness made it more powerful than any oratory could have. And then she said the thing that Jackson had not known she was going to say. "I want to tell the board something about these people," she said. "Not because I think you need to feel sorry for them. I don't want your sympathy. I want something harder than that. I want your recognition." She paused. Every person in that cabin worked for decades in this territory. They paid taxes, they built homes and raised children, and participated in the kind of ordinary, necessary life that makes a place worth living in. And then they got old, and their families moved on or disappeared or decided they were inconvenient. And the world, which had required so much from them when they were useful, simply forgot them. Her voice did not waver. "I decided not to forget them, and I'm asking this board to do the same." The room was completely silent. Forsyth started to rise. "If I may address, sit down, counsel." Fitch said it without heat and without negotiation. Forsyth sat. Fitch looked at the documents in front of him for a moment. Then he looked at Coleman. "Mr. Coleman," Fitch said, "I'd like to hear from you directly." Coleman stood. He was composed and well-dressed, and he chose his words carefully because he was a man who always chose his words carefully. He made his case for the development application in measured, reasonable terms: economic necessity, proper land, use the county's need for commercial development infrastructure. He was neither cruel nor dishonest. He was simply a man who had decided that the numbers were the most important thing and had built his entire argument around that premise. When he sat down, Fitch looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Coleman," Fitch said, "in your assessment of the economic value of this parcel, did you at any point consider the alternative cost? The cost to the county of providing housing and medical support for 9 elderly individuals with no other options?" Coleman paused. "The county would not necessarily be obligated." That wasn't the question. Coleman was quiet. "I see," Fitch said. He turned to his fellow board members. There was a brief, low conversation at the long table that the room could not quite hear. The 2 cautious board members leaned in and spoke and listened. Margaret Ellison said something short and definitive. The other board member nodded. Fitch looked up. "The board will take a 30-minute recess," he said. "We will return with a decision." The 30 minutes were the longest Jackson could remember sitting through, and he had sat through a great many long things in his life. He did not pace. He sat at the table with Holt, and he looked at his hands, and he did not speak because there was nothing useful to say. Robert sat beside him in the same stillness. Thomas, to his other side, was looking at the ceiling with the meditative calm of a man who had done what he could do and had made his peace with the outcome. He felt, rather than saw, Clara cross from the gallery to the empty chair beside him. She sat. She did not speak either. But she set her hands on the table, and they were near enough to his that he could feel the warmth of them, and that was enough. "It went well," she said quietly. Not a question. "I think so." Thomas was remarkable. He was. Robert was magnificent. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Whatever they decide." Clara. "I just want to say, whatever they decide," he said, "I'm not done. This doesn't end in this room. You understand that?" She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were steady and warm, and a little fierce the way they were when she had decided something. "I know," she said. "I know you're not." The board returned. Fitch sat down, arranged his papers, looked at the room. "The board has reviewed both claims," he said. "The commercial development application filed by Caldwell Western Properties is denied." He said it without drama and without pause, the way you say something that has been decided. The application does not meet the infrastructure requirements for the designated use, and the board finds substantial reason to question the application's good faith intent, given its timing in relation to the residential designation request. Forsyth's pen stopped moving on his notepad. Coleman went very still. Regarding the charitable dwelling designation requested by Mr. Jackson Whitaker, Fitch continued, the board finds the request to be consistent with territorial code provisions and adequately supported by the documentation submitted. The structural certification is accepted. The testimony presented supports the designation. He looked up from his papers. The property at this location is hereby designated as a permanent charitable dwelling under Territorial Code Section 47. This designation is recorded and binding. The room registered it. Not loudly. There was no outburst, no dramatic release. Just a ripple of breath across the gallery, a shift in the quality of the silence, the particular sensation of a weight that has been held a very long time, finally quietly touching ground. Beside Jackson, Clara exhaled once. Just once. And then she was composed again, as she always was, but her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been before, and her hands folded on the table were not quite steady. Thomas made a sound that was not a word. Robert reached over with his good arm and gripped Thomas's shoulder briefly and firmly, and Thomas put his hand over Robert's, and they stayed that way for a moment. Coleman stood abruptly and walked out without speaking. Forsyth followed him, gathering papers with the precise movements of a man in full professional retreat. Holt leaned to Jackson and said very quietly, "It held." "Yes," Jackson said. "Congratulations." Jackson looked at Clara. She was looking back at him. And in that look was everything that had accumulated over the past weeks, the mornings of work, the nights by the lamp, the grief over Edmund, the fear over Eleanor, the forms and the lawyers, and the endless practical necessity of holding something fragile together with two sets of hands that had not quite admitted yet how much they had come to rely on each other. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. She let him. They did not speak. They did not need to. The drive back to the cabin took 2 hours, and it was the quietest 2 hours Jackson could remember. Thomas slept briefly in the back of the wagon. Robert sat with his rolled map held carefully across his knees, looking out at the territory he had lived in and mapped and loved for 50 years. Clara sat beside Jackson on the driver's bench, and the cold was sharp, but neither of them moved apart from it. Halfway back, she said, "What happens now? Now we establish it properly. The designation gives us the legal framework, but there's work to do: governance documentation, a formal support structure, accounting." He paused. "And the cabin needs a name." Clara looked at him. "A name?" "It's a designated charitable dwelling. It should have a name, something that says what it is." Clara was quiet for a while, looking at the landscape they were moving through. "Brooks House," she said finally. "For Walter and Eleanor. They were here first. They opened the door." Jackson nodded. "Brooks House," he said. "That's right." When the wagon pulled up to the cabin, Harriet was on the porch despite the cold, her arms crossed and her expression containing the particular compressed anxiety of a woman who had been waiting for several hours and was covering it with impatience. She looked at their faces and read them the way she read everything, immediately, accurately, completely. "Well," she demanded. "It's ours," Clara said. Harriet stared at her for one held moment. Then she turned and went inside, and they heard her voice the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable, sharp with relief, with joy, with the particular incredulous gratitude of someone who had been expecting disappointment and had received something else entirely. By the time Jackson and Clara came through the door, the room was in motion. Walter, who had not left Eleanor's side in days, was gripping Harriet's arm with both hands and looking at Clara with an expression that Jackson had no language for, something too large for a single word. The emotion of a man who has spent most of his life accepting loss and has been handed without warning the opposite of it. "It's permanent?" Walter asked. "Permanent," Clara said. "It's recorded." Walter sat down. Not because he was unwell, because his legs had simply stopped holding him up against the force of it. Eleanor from her cot reached out and found his hand and held it. James said from his chair by the stove, "So we don't have to go." "You don't have to go," Clara said. James nodded once slowly and looked at the ceiling and said nothing else. But his hands, which had been gripping the arms of his chair for weeks with the unconscious tension of a man braced for eviction, went loose and open in his lap. That night, Harriet made the best meal she had ever produced in that kitchen. She cooked with the focused intensity of a woman who had something to celebrate and intended to celebrate it properly. And she refused all offers of help with the magnificent autocracy of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. They ate together around the small table and the extra board. Jackson had added to extend it, all of them crowded in with their elbows touching and the lamp turned up high and the stove going well against the winter cold outside. It was loud in a way the cabin almost never was. Thomas telling a story that kept getting interrupted by Harriet's commentary. Robert attempting to correct a detail in Thomas's geography, and Thomas arguing back with complete confidence in information he was mostly making up. James laughing for the first time. Jackson had heard Eleanor eating more than she had in weeks, because food tastes different when you're not afraid anymore. Jackson sat at the end of the table and looked at all of it. Clara was across from him, and she was laughing at something Harriet had said, genuinely laughing, without the managed composure she usually maintained, her whole face open and warm and unguarded. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, and he did not try to talk himself out of thinking so. She caught him looking. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Harriet and said something that made Harriet laugh too, and the moment passed, but it had happened, and they both knew it had happened, and neither of them was quite the same on the other side of it. In a minute, she came to stand beside him, not close but close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her in the cold air. They looked at the stars together without speaking. "I want to tell you something," he said finally. "All right. I've been thinking about what William said, at the beginning, that this was personal." He paused. He was right. It is personal, but not in the way he meant. He turned and looked at her. "It's personal because you're the most remarkable person I've met in my life, and what you've built here is the most genuine thing I've seen in 20 years of acquiring things that turned out to be empty. And He stopped. Clara was watching him with an expression he could not quite classify, attentive and still, and something underneath it that was warm and careful and not closed off in the way it had been when he first walked through that cabin door. Jackson," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's complicated. I was going to say..." She paused, took a breath. "I was going to say that I know what it costs a person to let someone in after they've decided not to. I know exactly how frightening it is, because I've been deciding not to let anyone in for a very long time." He waited. "And I've been watching you for 2 months, she said, work yourself to the bone for people you had no reason to help. Sacrifice things you didn't have to sacrifice. Choose over and over to stay when every instinct you built over 20 years was probably telling you to go." She looked at him steadily. "And I think..." She stopped again, then steadied. "I think you should know that it mattered, that I saw it, that it changed things. For me. The cold was significant, and the stars were very bright, and the cabin behind them was full of light and warmth, and people who were for the first time in years safe." "Clara," he said. "Don't say anything complicated," she said. "Not tonight." "All right." He turned back to the stars. "Then I'll just say, this is the best night I've had in 20 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it is." They stood together in the cold for a while longer, not touching, not needing to. The silence between them, the particular silence of two people who have decided without quite announcing the decision to stop being alone. When they went back inside, Harriet took one look at the two of them and said to no one in particular, finally, with such pointed satisfaction that Thomas choked on his coffee, and Eleanor from her cot covered her mouth with her hand and smiled. In the days that followed, the cabin became something else. Not all at once, it was never going to be all at once, because real things don't transform all at once. They shift and settle and find their new shape gradually, the way buildings do after a foundation is properly laid. Jackson hired a bookkeeper from Helena to help establish the charitable governance documentation. He contacted a church organization in Billings that had been doing similar work with a small fund available for exactly this kind of designation, and they became the first outside organization to formally support Brooks House with a quarterly contribution. He wrote letters, careful, factual, specific letters to 3 newspapers in the territory, describing what had been built and what it required, not as an appeal for sympathy, but as an account of something real that other people might wish to support. The first response came from an unexpected direction. A woman in Helena, named Mrs. Francis Alderman, no relation to the board chairman. She made clear, wrote back to say that her mother had spent her last 2 years in exactly the situation the letter described, and she had spent years wishing someone had done what Clara was doing, and she was enclosing a bank draft and the names of 2 physicians willing to volunteer time. The second response was from a farmer east of Helena, who said he had extra grain and didn't know what to do with it, and the letter made him think he did now. The third was from a woman who did not give her name, but enclosed a folded piece of paper with a single sentence. "Please tell the woman who started this that she gave me back my hope." Clara read that one 3 times, standing at the table with the letter in her hands, and did not say anything for a long while. "She's talking about you," Jackson said. "I know." Clara set the letter down carefully. "I just don't entirely know what to do with it." "Keep it," he said. "Put it somewhere you can find it on the hard days." She looked at him. "You sound like you've thought about this." "I've thought about a lot of things lately." Clara picked up the letter and folded it again and put it in her apron pocket. Then she picked up the bookkeeper's ledger and turned to the page she had been working on. "The Billings Fund contribution covers 2 months of medicine," she said. "If the grain donation comes through as promised, that handles the food cost through February." She looked up. "We're going to be all right through the winter." "Yes," Jackson said. "We are." She smiled. Just briefly, the quick, warm smile that arrived without announcement and disappeared before she decided it was safe. But this time, it did not entirely disappear. "There's still the east fence to repair," she said. "I know." "And the well cover needs replacing." "I know." "And Robert wants to remap the full property now that the addition is finished." "Tell Robert he has full authorization." Jackson reached across the table and pulled the ledger toward him. "Show me where you are in the accounts." Clara pulled her chair around to his side of the table and sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and opened the ledger to the relevant page, and they bent over it together in the lamplight, the way they had bent over those county forms on that first desperate night, working side by side with the easy, unannounced familiarity of 2 people who have stopped pretending they aren't exactly where they are. Outside, the December wind moved across Montana. Inside Brooks' house, someone was laughing. Someone always seemed to be laughing now. And Jackson Whitaker, who had owned thousands of acres and sat in rooms full of expensive furniture and had still managed to be completely, precisely, absolutely alone, sat beside Clara Bennett in the small circle of lamplight and felt running through him, like the first warmth after a long cold, the particular sensation of a man who has finally, after everything, come home. Winter deepened across Montana in the weeks after the hearing, and Brooks' house deepened with it, not in size yet, but in something harder to measure and more important. The cold outside became the kind that tests structures and the people inside them, and the cabin held, and the people inside held, and Jackson discovered that watching something you helped build endure its first real trial is a particular kind of satisfaction that no land acquisition had ever given him. He had moved out of his Helena mansion by the middle of December. He had not made a dramatic announcement about it. He had simply stopped going back. One evening he realized he had not slept in Helena in 11 days, and he went back the following morning to collect what he needed and arrange for the house to be managed by a caretaker. And when he rode away from it for the last time, he did not look back. The mansion had never been a home. It had been a performance of success, and he no longer needed to perform. He built himself a modest structure on the eastern edge of the property. 2 rooms, solid construction, close enough to the cabin that he could be there in minutes if something was needed, but far enough to give Clara the space that mattered to her. She had not asked for it. He had understood it without being asked. That was how most of the important understandings between them worked. The bookkeeper, a precise young man named Arthur, who had initially been skeptical of the whole enterprise and had become over 3 weeks of working with Clara's meticulous records. A committed advocate for it came out twice a week and was making significant progress on the governance documentation. The charitable designation was formally recorded. The quarterly contribution from the Billings organization arrived as promised. The letters Jackson had sent to the territorial newspapers had produced by the end of December A steady trickle of responses. Small donations, offers of goods. 2 more physicians willing to volunteer time, and 1 letter from a woman in Great Falls who said she had an elderly neighbor who had nowhere to go and was there any possibility. Clara wrote back to the woman in Great Falls the same evening. "We have room," she said when Jackson asked her about the letter. "We have 1 small room. Then we'll make it work." She set down her pen and looked at him. "That's what we do, Jackson. We make it work." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll start on the addition framing tomorrow." She smiled and picked up her pen and kept writing. The new resident arrived in January. Her name was Vera Hutchins, 78 years old, from Great Falls, and she had spent the previous autumn sleeping in a church anteroom because her neighbor's daughter had finally run out of patience. She was small and white-haired, and alarmingly sharp-tongued, and within 48 hours of arriving, she and Harriet had established a rivalry of opinions that enlivened every meal and delighted everyone who was not directly in the line of fire. "She's perfect," Thomas told Jackson quietly, watching Harriet and Vera argue about the proper way to mend a seam. "She's chaos," Jackson said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "We needed more chaos. It keeps us honest." Eleanor was improving. Slowly, carefully, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided she was not finished. Yet she was reclaiming ground from the weakness that had taken her down in November. Dr. Pryor came out every 2 weeks and tracked her progress with careful satisfaction, and by February, she was sitting at the table for meals, and by March, she was occasionally on the porch in the afternoon, and every morning she said she was fine, and every morning Clara watched her with professional attention and confirmed that she was in fact getting finer. Walter's shoulders straightened by increments as Eleanor recovered. Jackson watched it happen the way you watch something you didn't know you'd been holding your breath about, relieved in a way that went deeper than he expected, because he had come to love Walter Brooks with the quiet, uncomplicated love you develop for a man who embodies dignity under pressure, and he had not wanted to see that dignity broken. "She's going to outlast us all," Walter told him one morning in February, watching Eleanor argue with Harriet about something from inside. "She might," Jackson said. "She definitely will." Walter looked at him. "And you? Are you going to outlast us all too?" Jackson looked at the cabin. "I'm planning to stick around." "Good." Walter nodded once. "She needs someone who plans to stick around." Jackson understood they were no longer talking about Eleanor. He said nothing. But he felt the truth of it settle into him like the first warmth of the season, certain and quiet. Spring came, the way spring always comes in Montana, not gently, but definitively, like a decision that's been made and is no longer open for debate. The ground thawed. The creek ran strong. The light changed quality in a way that shifted everything it touched. And on the first morning in April, that was warm enough to eat outside. Harriet carried the breakfast table through the cabin door with Thomas's help and set it in the yard and informed everyone that they were eating outside, whether they liked it or not, because she had spent enough of the winter indoors to last her until the following February. They ate outside. All of them crowded around the table in the thin April sun. Thomas and Robert and Harriet and Vera arguing and laughing. James eating with the particular quiet contentment of a man who has made his peace with something large and invisible. Eleanor, sitting with her face tilted toward the sun, like a flower that has been waiting. Walter beside her with his hand on hers. The 2 new residents who had arrived in February. A man named George, who had been a school teacher for 40 years, and a woman named Ruth, who did not say much, but whose smile was the kind that lit the full room it entered. And Clara passing bread to Thomas, and listening to something Robert was explaining about the property's spring drainage, and laughing at Harriet's interjection, and keeping the whole complicated, beautiful, improbable organism of this family running with the same quiet, constant, unglamorous devotion she had brought to it from the very beginning. Jackson watched all of this from the edge of the table, and understood not for the first time, but more completely than before, that he was looking at the most valuable thing he had ever been involved in building. Then Thomas made a sound that was not quite a word, and everyone at the table went still. A horse was coming up the drive. The rider was young, 25, maybe 30, with a face that had Thomas's jaw and Thomas's eyes, and the uncomfortable expression of a man who has done something wrong and has been sitting with the awareness of it for long enough that it has become unbearable. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at the table and all the people around it, and his gaze found Thomas and stopped. "Pa," he said. Thomas did not move for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table. His face had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not calm, but the expression of a man managing something seismic. "Daniel," Thomas said. The young man dismounted. He held his hat in both hands. He was looking at Thomas the way a person looks when they have rehearsed something many times and have just discovered that none of their rehearsal is useful. "I know I don't have any right to be here," Daniel said. "No," Thomas agreed. "You don't." Daniel absorbed this. "I drove up from Billings. I've been driving for 2 days." He paused. "I tried to find you 6 months ago. The address I had was wrong. I didn't know—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know about this place." "You didn't come looking very hard," Thomas said. It was quiet. The table held very still. Nobody looked away. "No," Daniel said. "I didn't. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you I had good reasons because I've been thinking about it for 2 days, and I'm not sure I did." He held his hat tighter. "I came because I want to try to fix it if you'll let me. If you won't, I understand that too." Thomas looked at his son for a long time. Jackson watched Thomas's face and saw everything moving through it. The year of waiting, the letters that said, "Soon the June that came and went," the particular grief of a father who had loved a son and been found inconvenient. He saw Thomas feel all of it without leaving the table or raising his voice. "Sit down," Thomas said finally. "Harriet, is there more coffee?" "There is always more coffee," Harriet said with the decisive authority of a woman who had decided the crisis was manageable and was already moving. Daniel sat. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning, which is a different and more complicated thing. But Thomas's hand, which had been flat and still on the table, moved to his coffee cup, and something in his shoulders that had been braced against something for a year finally let it go. Clara caught Jackson's eye across the table. He gave her a small nod. She looked back at Thomas and Daniel, and whatever was beginning between them and her expression was the expression of someone who has spent 7 years building a place where things like this can happen, and who understands without sentimentality that this is exactly what it was for. That afternoon, while Daniel and Thomas walked the property together, Daniel listening, Thomas talking in the unhurried way he had when he was telling something true, Jackson found himself standing beside Clara at the edge of the yard. "You knew he'd come eventually," Jackson said. "I hoped," Clara said. "There's a difference." "What made you hope?" Clara thought about it. "Because Thomas never stopped being proud of him. Even when he was hurt. He'd talk about Daniel's work, his family, what he'd built. A man who's given up on someone doesn't talk about them that way." She paused. "I wasn't waiting for an apology. He was waiting for Daniel to find his way back to himself." Jackson looked at her. "You see people very clearly." "I've had a lot of practice." "You saw me clearly," he said. "From the beginning." She turned and looked at him directly. It was a clear April afternoon, and the light was the particular gold of early spring, and Clara Bennett was looking at him with those steady brown eyes that had always seen exactly what was there and had never flinched from it. "I saw a man who was lonely and didn't know how to stop being lonely," she said. "And I saw a man who, when he found something worth staying for, stayed." She paused. "The second thing matters more than the first." Jackson took a breath. He had been carrying what he wanted to say for weeks, moving it carefully the way you carry something fragile, waiting for the right moment. And he understood now that there was no right moment except the present one. "Clara," he said. "Jackson, I want to ask you something." She waited. "Not about the house, not about the residence or the accounts or the east wall." He held her gaze. "I want to ask you something that's just about us." Clara's expression was entirely still. Not closed open, actually. In a way, it had taken months to become the openness of a person who has decided to stop protecting herself against the possibility of something good. "Then ask," she said. "I've spent 20 years being very efficient at not needing anyone," he said. And then I rode out to a piece of land in October, and I found a woman who had spent 7 years building a home for people nobody wanted with almost nothing out of sheer stubborn love. And I understood standing in that doorway that I had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. He paused. I'm not going to promise I'll always know the right thing to say. I won't. I've been bad at that for a long time. But I can promise you that I will always stay. And I will always show up. And I will never in my life make you feel invisible. He looked at her. That's not nothing. Clara looked at him for a long moment. No, she said softly. It's not nothing. It's everything. Then will you? Yes, she said, before he finished. Clearly and without hesitation, the way Clara said every true thing, without decoration and without apology. Yes, Jackson. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Simply the way you take the hand of someone you have decided to stop being separate from. She held it with the same strong, capable grip she brought to everything direct and certain, and entirely unself-consciously herself. From the porch where Harriet had materialized with the supernatural timing she always seemed to produce for significant moments, came a sound that was half cough and half triumphant comment, followed immediately by Eleanor's voice, saying something sharp and happy that carried across the yard. I did not say anything, Harriet announced to no one in particular. You were thinking it loudly, Robert called from inside. I'm allowed to think. Debatable, said Vera. Clara laughed. Jackson laughed too, and it surprised him slightly the way it always did. The ease of it, the genuineness. The way being in this place among these people had returned to him something he hadn't known he'd lost. He did not let go of her hand. What came next arrived not all at once, but in the patient accumulative way that real things always do. The town of Helena did not transform overnight into a place of universal welcome and understanding. People are not built for that kind of speed. But things shifted the way glaciers shift slowly, and with enormous force, so that by the time you notice the change, the landscape has already been remade. It started with Dr. Pryor. He began talking about Brooks' house in Helena, not loudly or evangelically, but in the specific, useful way that a doctor talks about a thing that is working. He mentioned it to colleagues. He mentioned it at the County Medical Association. He mentioned it to patients whose elderly relatives had nowhere to go. He was a man who dealt in evidence, and the evidence at Brooks' house was clear. People who had been expected to decline were stable or improving, and the reason was the quality of care they were receiving. By May, a second physician, a younger woman named Dr. Anita Marsh, one of the few female doctors in the territory who had been looking for a way to do medicine that aligned with what she believed medicine was for, had begun volunteering at Brooks' house twice a month. She arrived the first time with the careful reserve of someone entering an unknown situation, and she left that evening with the specific look of someone who had found exactly the thing they had been looking for. She told Clara on her way out, I've been practicing medicine for 6 years, and this is the first place I've worked where the patients feel like people. Clara said, They've always been people. The world just forgot to treat them that way. Dr. Marsh came back the following week. She kept coming. The newspaper coverage, when it arrived properly, came from a direction Jackson had not anticipated. A young journalist named Harper from the Helena Weekly Register rode out in May with a notebook and the somewhat skeptical air of someone who had been assigned a human interest story and was not entirely sure it was going to be interesting. She spent a full day at Brooks' house talking to the residents and following Clara through her work and sitting in the yard with Robert while he explained his maps. The story she wrote was not sentimental. It was precise and specific and humanizing in the way that only precision can achieve. She described what each person had done in their lives before they came here, and what they were doing now, and what the difference was between the two, and she let that difference speak for itself. She quoted Harriet in full and did not soften the sharpness. She quoted Thomas talking about Daniel's visit with a restraint and dignity that made the reader understand without being told everything that visit had cost and meant. She described Clara simply as the woman who had decided not to forget. The article ran on a Thursday. By Saturday, 3 more letters had arrived. By the following Thursday, a delegation from a Helena church organization came to the property to discuss whether their charitable fund could be formally aligned with Brooks House's work. Clara received them in the yard. She had decided early on that she would not pretend the cabin was more than it was to impress anyone, and people seemed to respect her more for it, and answered their questions directly, and negotiated the terms without either eagerness or false modesty. Jackson stayed out of that conversation. It was hers. He had understood that from the beginning, and he understood it more clearly now that his role was not to lead this, but to support it, to put his resources, and his determination, and his willingness to fight where they were needed, and then step back and let Clara be what she had always been, the person this was built around. He told her so. One evening in May, sitting outside on the bench, Thomas and Robert had built together in a collaboration that had taken 2 weeks and produced a bench of monumental solidity. "You could be the one talking to the churches," he said. "You're the one with the connections now, the legal standing, the—" "I know," she said. "And I am. That's what I do." She paused. "What I mean is that this was always yours as much as mine. You didn't just provide resources, you provided something harder." "What's that?" Clara looked at her hands. "You believed it was worth fighting for, before there was any reason to think it would win." She looked up at him. "I've been doing this for 7 years. And in 7 years, nobody, not one person, stood between me and the people trying to take it away. Until you." She held his gaze. "That changes a person. Having someone stand in front of the door and say, 'Not today. Not while I'm here.'" She paused. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay it," Jackson said. "That's not what it was." She nodded slowly. Then she leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat together in the May evening, with the sounds of the cabin around them. Harriet's voice, Robert and Thomas arguing about something inconsequential and enjoyable. Eleanor's laugh, thin but real. He put his arm around her. She let him. They sat that way for a long time, watching the light go out of the Montana sky by degrees, and neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and what remained between them was better than language. The summer brought a visiting minister from Billings, who held a small outdoor service at Brooks' house on a Sunday in July, and afterward told Jackson quietly that he had never conducted a service in a place that felt more like what church was supposed to feel like. Jackson nodded and said he thought he understood why, and the minister looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has recognized something true in someone else and is glad for the recognition. The summer brought George, the schoolteacher, establishing a reading circle on Tuesday afternoons, which quickly became the most fiercely contested hour of the week, with Vera and Harriet competing for interpretive authority over every text, and Robert providing cartographic footnotes nobody had asked for, but everyone appreciated. The summer brought Ruth speaking finally in full sentences about her life before the 50 years in a house that had been her whole world, the year after her husband died, when the world contracted to almost nothing. The morning she arrived at Brooks' house, and Harriet had put a cup of coffee in her hands before she'd even sat down. And how that small act had been the first ordinary human warmth she'd felt in longer than she could accurately account for. Ruth told Clara this in August in the kitchen while they were preserving vegetables. Clara listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, Clara said, "I'm glad you're here, Ruth." Ruth said, "So am I." And that was enough. It was always enough, the true and simple things. That was what Clara had always understood, and what Jackson had spent 20 years forgetting, and had finally here learned again. In September, on a Saturday, that was the particular gold and clear of early Montana autumn, Thomas Reeves's son, Daniel, returned. Not for a visit this time. He brought his wife and his 2 children and a wagon of belongings, and told Thomas he had found work in Helena and had arranged housing in town, 20 minutes ride away. Thomas stood in the yard and looked at his grandchildren, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, who were looking at the cabin and the yard, and all the people with the wide, absorbing attention of children encountering something genuinely new, and the expression on his face was one that Jackson knew he would not find words for and did not try to. "They can come on Sundays," Thomas said to Daniel. "Every Sunday," Daniel said. Thomas put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Just for a moment." Then he crouched down in front of his grandchildren and said, "Have you ever heard the story about the worst cattle drive in the history of Montana?" The girl shook her head. "Good," said Thomas, "because I've been saving it." He took the children inside. Daniel stood in the yard watching the door close behind his father, and he pressed his hand flat against his sternum for a moment, the way you do when something hits a place you were not expecting. "Thank you," he said to Jackson and Clara both. "Thank you for coming back," Clara said simply. That was all. It was enough. On the last day of September, Jackson stood at the eastern edge of the property in the early morning before anyone else was moving and looked out at the land he had purchased 1 year before, with a deed of title and no particular feeling about it, except that the price had been reasonable and the seller had been desperate. 1 year. I thought about the man he had been then. The efficiency and the emptiness. The thousands of acres and the hollow rooms. The 20 years of performing contentment so consistently that he had almost convinced himself it was the real thing. He heard boots on the frozen grass and knew before he turned. Clara came to stand beside him. She did not say anything for a moment, just stood looking at the land that was theirs now, in the only way that mattered, not on a deed, but in the life that had been built on it. 1 year, she said. 1 year. She slipped her hand into his. He held it. "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about Thomas and his grandchildren, about Eleanor who had survived the winter and was planning to survive another, about Harriet and Vera who had developed a friendship neither of them would admit to and both of them depended on, about Robert's maps covering the walls of the East Room, now the full territory rendered in his precise and loving hand, about Ruth who had started speaking, and George who was teaching anyone who wanted to learn, and Vera who had decided she had opinions about everything and intended to share all of them before she ran out of time. I thought about Clara, who had built all of this out of nothing except the decision not to look away, and who was standing beside him now with her hand in his, having made at some point in the past year the decision to let him stand beside her. He thought about a 12-year-old boy standing at the edge of a grave, certain he was alone. He had been wrong. "Yes," Jackson Whitaker said. "I am." The sun came up over the Montana hills and lit the land gold, and in the cabin behind them, someone was already up and moving. The small sounds of a morning beginning of people waking into a day that was theirs, of a home being exactly what a home is supposed to be. Not a grand mansion, not a profitable parcel, not an empire built on distance and discipline and the careful suppression of everything that hurt. Just this. Just people who had been forgotten remembered. People who had been cast off held. People who had been told they were too old, too broken, too much, gathered into one place by a woman who had refused to believe any of it, and a man who had ridden out one October morning to evict an elderly couple and had instead found the only thing he had ever truly needed. A family does not require blood. A home does not require size. And wealth, real wealth, the kind that compounds not in banks, but in the quality of the hours you live, is measured only by this: how many lives become fuller because you were present in them. Clara Bennett had known this all along. Jackson Whitaker had learned it just in time. And on the land they had fought for together, in the home they had built together, surrounded by the people they had refused to abandon. They stood in the morning light holding on, and that was enough. That was everything.